I'm Oita Coleman, Senior Advisor of the Open Voice Network. I would like to welcome you to the latest installation of our webinar series, Global Standards for Conversational AI. This series is a joint coordination of white papers and webinars published and hosted by the communities and working groups of the Open Voice Network. The Open Voice Network operates as an open source community of the Linux Foundation. And as such, we adhere to the antitrust statement, which states Linux Foundation meetings involve participation by industry competitors, and it is the intention of the Linux Foundation to conduct all the activities in accordance with applicable antitrust and competition laws. It is therefore extremely important that all attendees adhere to meeting agendas and be aware of and not participate in any activities that are prohibited under applicable U.S. state, federal, or foreign antitrust and competition laws. Examples of types of actions that are prohibited at Linux Foundation meetings and in connection with Linux Foundation activities are described in the Linux Foundation antitrust policy available at the link on your screen. If you have questions about these matters, please contact your company counsel, or if you are a member of the Linux Foundation, feel free to contact Andrew Updegrove of the firm Gesmer Updegrove LLP, which provides legal counsel to the Linux Foundation. In today's webinar, you will hear from members of our Ethical Use Task Force, along with a special guest, as they highlight key findings from our recent publication, Ethical Guidelines for Voice Experiences. Together, we will share our thoughts on the importance of educating and advocating for more ethical and inclusive conversational AI. We'd also like to hear from you, so I encourage you to stay for a scheduled Q&A with the panelists. To that end, if you have questions during the discussion, feel free to type them in chat or the Q&A, and we'll address them at the end. Let's introduce our panelists. Emily Banzhaf is a content designer and conversation voice designer at Willow Tree, as well as a professional violinist. She co-moderates the Ethical Use Task Force at the Open Voice Network and co-hosts the Voice Spark Live podcast. Recent engagements include speaking about voice ethics at Voice Den. Awards include winning the Digital Assistant Academy's Hackathon 2021. Valeria Barbero is business director for Mother Tongue Omnicom. She has worked in different verticals in the broader language service industry. Currently, she is leading two programs, one on the linguistic and cultural adaptation of voice-first content, and the second on the creation of high-quality data to train conversational AI models. She is co-moderator of the Ethical Use Task Force and an ambassador for the Open Voice Network. Shilpi Agarwal is the founder, executive director, and president of Data Ethics for All, a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to raise awareness on the ethical use of the entire end-to-end data pipeline. In just 2 years, Data Ethics for All has built a global audience of over 100,000 supporters from 55 countries. Open Voice Network is proud to announce an official partnership with Data Ethics for All and support Shilpi's work, which is focused on raising the next generation of ethics first champions and building a better data and AI enterprise world. The Open Voice Network's brand statement is voice worthy of user trust. Emily, let's begin with you. Can you share how the work of the Ethical Use Task Force supports this vision and provide background on the research and findings which led to the Ethical Guidelines for Voice Experiences white paper?
Sure. Hello. So as Oita mentioned, Oita, Valeria, and I are currently leading the Ethical Use Task Force, and we have about 10 members that attend on a regular basis from all different backgrounds. For almost 2 years now, we've had weekly meetings to review, discuss, analyze, and interpret reputable sources of information related to voice and ethics, and attend ethics-related events. And we've also brought in experts from various fields to share their knowledge and resources about ethics. So this white paper is a reflection of our discussions, research, and analysis of information brought up in our meetings, information from the events we've attended, and our own individual research. So we started by coming up with research questions, harmful incidents and vulnerabilities, and how can we prevent them from happening in the future? And there are a few others. But in general, there are a lot of resources for general AI ethics, but we really wanted to focus on voice-specific guidelines. So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the voice data analysis section. So what you see on the screen is a voice data analysis chart to highlight the different types of personal information that can be taken from a voice. It's kind of split up into 3 different sections, which are identity, intent, and health. So the sound of every human voice is unique, which makes it a valuable tool for enterprises and organizations. These characteristics in your voice can be processed and analyzed for various purposes, such as voice biometric identification or determining and verifying identity, speech emotion recognition or assessing emotional state, evaluating people and making decisions for opportunities such as jobs, loans, housing, and others, and vocal biomarker analysis for detecting diseases. So the analysis of the voice focuses on the characteristics of the sound that are there when someone's talking, such as tone, speed, duration, volume, and pitch. So voice technology can identify, analyze, and deduce sensitive personal information related to someone's identity, physical characteristics, physical health, mental health, socioeconomic status, location, emotions, intent, and more. So this information can be used to make decisions and recommendations regarding people's lives that could potentially cause irreparable harm if it's not properly managed and secured. Prison convictions have been made based on voice analysis, only to be overturned years later because of contradictory DNA evidence. So these types of decisions and outcomes can be prevented and mitigated if the proper measures and guidelines are in place. So voice analysis can generate a complete personality profile and correlate the profile to sensitive categories such as race, ethnicity, or gender, which can lead to bias and discrimination. So for example, as more companies are using voice technology to help facilitate hiring and interview decisions, candidates could be denied jobs because of algorithms favoring specific attributes. Studies also show that voice technology is biased against women, people of color, and people that have accents, and other minority groups. In a study conducted by Dr. John Baugh, landlords were more likely to deny housing opportunities to prospective tenants of color based solely on the sound of their voice, regardless of their qualifications. And the term for this is linguistic profiling. So with these ethical guidelines, our goal is to help prevent bias and discrimination as a result of data sets that are not representative of the actual population and other factors. In the medical field, specific features and signals in the sound, also known as biomarkers, can potentially be analyzed to detect, treat, monitor, and prevent cardiovascular diseases, neurological disorders, and psychiatric disorders. However, like other biomarkers, voice biomarker analysis comes with concerns of accuracy, bias, privacy, and interpretation, especially when it comes to something as serious as diagnosing diseases. So it's important not to rely solely on voice analysis when making important medical decisions. Extra caution should also be used when relying on speech emotion recognition and sentiment analysis to personalize experiences or market products to people. In voice experiences, both spoken words and the sound of the voice can be analyzed to assess someone's emotional state. Sentiment analysis determines how people are feeling based on the words that they use, and speech emotion recognition determines how people are feeling based on the sound of their voice. So emotional states such as happiness, sadness, fear, and anger can potentially be detected, as well as physiological states such as intoxication and hunger. So while the intention of using voice analysis might be to improve consumer experiences and create mutually beneficial outcomes, those outcomes are not always desirable or accurate, which means decisions should not be made solely based on voice data analysis, and ethical standards and guidelines should be implemented to mitigate harm from the use of personal voice data. So now I'm going to pass it along to Valeria to talk about the ethical principles that we came up with.
Thanks, Emily. Okay. So basically, when we were discussing, what kind of principles we should select to be at the core of our guidelines, we had two main goals. On the one hand, we really wanted to be aligned with the broader AI ethics field and make sure that we reviewed the same principles that are advocated by AI ethics. On the other hand, we also wanted to make sure that we cover all the peculiarities of voice that are, as you saw from Emily's presentation, they can be quite different from the general AI. So we wanted to make sure that we do have guidance that covers voice in particular. So based on that, then we selected these basically 6 principles. Of those, and you see them represented here. Of those, governance and compliance, we think, is really the basic minimum that any company that implements voice products should have implemented, and make sure not only that they follow the legislation and the best practices in the industry, but also that they have a minimum of internal structure that supports that and ensures that the internal policies are constantly reviewed and aligned with what is happening in the legal field, in the regulation, and in the best practices that are constantly changing with the evolution of technology. Now, a very important principle, of course, is privacy. And as we have seen with voice being highly biometrical in nature, it is particularly important that voice products pay particular attention to privacy, because with every voice interaction, there is so much personal information that is shared, and it is all very sensitive information that people may not at all be aware that they are actually sharing. So it's really important that special attention be paid to privacy. Now, of all the principles here, privacy is actually the most well-known one, the most regulated one, and the one that usually companies have at least a minimum already implemented at part of their terms and conditions. But the other principles are not yet regulated by law. They are best practices. They are part of many companies' package of responsible AI, but they do not really have any legislative backing at this point. Privacy does, because it is linked to a basic human right. The second principles that we thought it was extremely important for when it comes to voice is transparency. When companies implement voice, the users don't necessarily know that this is AI-based technology. So it's very important that companies actually disclose that AI technology is being used, and that and how also that impacts the privacy, for example, or the rights of the users, how the data is managed. Now, all this communication should have transparency at its core, is not just there to provide liability for the company, but the company should really put the user at the center of the transparency and ensure that the language used is non-technical, not legal, and the user can truly understand what kind of experience is the user engaging in, what kind of data is sharing, how is that data managed and stored by the company. The third principle we want to acknowledge is accountability. Now, of course, accountability is important because we need to have a process and we need to ensure that we can retrace responsibility for the decisions taken, for the steps implemented, and we have a very clear feedback loop through which we can ensure that if something goes wrong, we can at least learn from it, and we can, make amends and start from scratch, redesign a process where we have very clear responsibilities. Without this, you could have a very sophisticated ethical frameworks, but it becomes meaningless if you do not have these processes through which you implement it. Next up is inclusivity. And I must say that at the Open Voice Network, inclusivity is very dear to our hearts, not just because, of course, it's definitely a best practice in general in AI, but because we truly believe that voice has the potential to increase the reach of the digital world to many segments around the world that are currently underserved. And this is a great potential of voice. However, for voice products to actually realize that, they need to be enabled and designed in a way that is truly inclusive from the start. So, started from the data, the data that is used to train AI models should include all dialects, accents, speech patterns, inflections that are truly representative of the broader populations. Otherwise, we will have products that use voice and are definitely more convenient. They are definitely faster, but they are not truly inclusive. So this is what voice products should really aim at realize, as this is the nature of voice itself. And the last but not least is sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability and its relevance in this context is that whenever, with every new technology, and voice here is no exception, there are obviously a great deal of positive that are brought in, but there is also potential for harm. And what we would ask here is that every new product, every new service that uses voice technology is carefully evaluated, not just for its commercial impact, but for its real impact on society. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if we think about a voice assistant, for example, and some of the questions that we brought up, at the beginning of this presentation, if we think about the impact that selecting a wake word, selecting a persona for the assistant can have, it can really impact society in that it will help propagate some negative stereotypings that we really don't want to see persist in society. Right? So this is what we mean for sustainability. Take good care and choose responsibly when evaluate your product. Is this going to have repercussions on society? Is it going to impact some children or adults, or any segment that can be harmfully impacted? Then a responsible decision should be made, and the long-term social impact should be taken into account when thinking about the implementation of voice technology. And what this means is, once you have all of this together and you really start thinking about your users and your products from an ethical perspective, this is what it means to have realized an ethical mindset and have brought that into your products.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Valeria, for giving background on the ethical guidelines white paper. And before we move to Shilpi, I want to remind you, feel free to, if you have any questions that have come to your mind during the discussion or just in general, feel free to use the Q&A and we will address them at the end. And so both Emily and Valeria talked about the values to be promoted and their rights to be respected. And as Valeria summed up and talked about, a more inclusive, ethical world, honoring and respecting the rights of individuals. The work that Shilpi does helps support that. So can you share, as real world example, how you are advocating and educating on ethical principles?
Yes, thank you, Oita. Emily and Valeria, great presentation, great work. Really admire everything that you have done and brought a framework to this very much needed industry. I'm going to build up on what Valeria talked about, sustainability and impact considerations. And since we work a lot with youth, I will be talking about the impact of conversational AI on children. So conversational AI definitely affects cognitive and linguistic development of children, which involves education, learning, and access. Now, AI has a great role to help young people learn and develop these skills, particularly helpful for young people with impairments. So as it was mentioned, this definitely technology has the potential of breaking barriers and serving the underserved markets, as well as inclusiveness for everyone. But there are also some concerns. Conversational AI provides access to internet searching and affects children question asking behavior, which affects their cognitive development. Children have access through voice technology to information that would usually require the ability to read and write, and it is for much older audiences. But because they learn how to speak at a younger age, earlier than they can read and write, they now have access to the entire search and try to get answers of things that they are not yet mature enough to handle. Voice assistance can affect linguistic habits of children, particularly with respect to politeness, which can result in their interpersonal dealings later in life. And as children's speech is not yet developed, as they are using these voice agents, they may not understand them well. So people who are building these technologies must really think about these inclusive solutions and their audiences. It also impacts social and moral codes of behavior for children. They get attached to these devices as personal, and there is a concern that these kind of attachments should only be limited to like a human to human interaction and not for technology. And there's also that children expect instant gratification and immediate response requests because they get that through these voice technologies, and they expect that even with their interaction with humans, which may not be the right expectation. And people who are developing these technologies must also consider that native speakers of the language must be included in the design and development of such technologies, because children are just learning to form dialogue, speech, and draw meaning, and thus form relationships through these answers that they're getting. Obviously, the privacy security concerns and the biometric data that voice brings has been covered. And so that is a big ethical concern, especially for young kids who's until they turn 18, we don't even know that their private information is circulating on the dark web. And so these kind of issues need to be addressed really carefully. And with that, I would like to invite you all to join us in creating a better data and AI world and learn more about what Data Ethics for All does and join in the movement at dataethicsforall.org. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shilpi, and thank you for sharing the work that you're doing. That's so important, because as you are educating and advocating across it, as your bio said, so far 55 countries, it is very clear that it's a global movement, and it's something as well as what the Open Voice Network is supporting. And so before we move to Q&A, I'd like to just provide the panelists an opportunity to summarize our call for action. So, Emily, what's your call to action?
Sure. So the first thing we would love people to do is to read our white paper and give us your feedback. And you can do that by visiting our website. We have it up there, and there's also a form for feedback. And we would just want to iterate on this and make it as comprehensive as possible in the future.
All right, Valeria.
I would like to see more people involved and well educated about technology and about this technology, and at the same time actively involved in educating others, and increasingly have knowledge of what this technology is, what it can do, and how it can be implemented, and the kind of harms that it can potentially bring, so that there is more collective knowledge for everyone, industry practitioners and users.
All right, Shilpi.
Yeah, I definitely agree that this is a great technology, one that can break barriers across generations, across global geolocations, across gender. But we definitely need to understand the advantages as well as harms when we are building these technologies. And we need to have an ethics first mindset, put ethics at the forefront and the user at the forefront by design. And ethics cannot be an afterthought in any of these.
All right, thank you. So we have some questions. So let's start with there's one from Boris. Boris asks, do you have guidelines or thoughts about how we can work out the long-term consequence of the decisions we make when creating voice AI, i.e., the gender of the voice is a popular example. Users might be expecting and be more comfortable if the assistant is female, but it might perpetuate some sexist patterns in a given culture. So, Valeria, you want to take that question?
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't say on some culture, pretty much in all cultures, unfortunately. And so there is actually some research that shows that in general, people prefer an assistant with a female name. And often this is because assistants are perceived, the assistant is someone that is hierarchically a little bit lower than yourself. The assistant is someone you give commands to. The assistant is someone that is there at your service. And this is a role that traditionally is identified with women. But this is a very dangerous stereotype that we are going to perpetrate. And, this has been inflicted in our generations and the previous one. We don't need to inflict it into the younger generation. So what can we do about this? Well, started from the wake words. Don't choose a woman word. The Alexa, the Siri, they're all associated with women. And therefore, you propagate the stereotype. With voice, give the users a choice of the words, it does, or of the voice. It doesn't have to be a woman voice. And even in the content, just make sure that you have content that is gender neutral, that the assistant doesn't have an attitude that is very passive when the users are abusing it in the way that it propagates gender stereotype. So as you can see, there is really a lot that you can do. It starts like any AI product from the type of data that you gather, and it develops until the release of the product throughout the development cycle.
All right. Any other thoughts, Emily, Shilpi?
So one thought, it has not been implemented yet, but things to consider is, why is that we choose one voice and then it stays like for the duration of our device interaction, that voice stays the same. Why don't we have that the assistant voice can be a male or female, and it can be a random multiple users, but also, and if the user has only chosen one, you still have multiple voices that give you the answers. That way, it's not always a female voice answering to all your questions. Sometimes it's a male voice. Sometimes it's a young child's voice. There can be differences in nuances of context, language, age, and gender.
All right. Very good. Emily, I'm going to start with you on this question. Catherine says, thank you for your hard work with how common voice assistants are with consumers. How can we better educate users on voice-related risks?
I think that's something we can accomplish through just talking to people in the community, and trying to get as much information out there as possible, with events and papers, infographics. And that is something the Open Voice Network is going to try to work on within the coming months to try to raise more awareness for people. And I think also trying to get organizations and enterprises to be more upfront with the voice-related risks when they're giving the terms and conditions and that kind of stuff. So I think those are a couple things we can do.
All right, very good. So this question, Jim Larson had a question. There's two questions. I'm going to combine them into one, or because they're similar. Is how should ethical disputes be resolved, and how are cultural differences reconciled? So, what are your thoughts on that, Shilpi?
I think that we need a diverse body, a really cognitive body, to resolve such ethical dilemmas or even discuss them, bring them to the table. We really need lived experiences besides expert opinions of different people on the table who can bring different viewpoints and talk about the problem through different lenses. And that will help us understand what may be ethical for one group of people may or may not be ethical for the other group. And so by coming to this common understanding through open voice of discussion is the only way to resolve any issues internally within a company or externally. And even within companies, even though they only rely on internal employees, I feel that there needs to be, every company should work with an external independent body of cognitive experts who can bring these lived experiences and lenses to the table.
Thank you. Thank you for that great answer. So Janice, welcome, part of the Open Voice Network. Good to hear your question. And Valeria, this is right up your with the work we're doing. Janice asks, are there guidelines out there that we can look to when we are developing new products? So this kind of speaks to operationalizing our guidelines.
Yes, definitely. So, you know, what Emily was saying before, that, you know, you should go to our website, give us feedback. We really want our guidelines to have a very practical bent. We want them to be implemented, and we want them to help developers and product managers, you know, whoever can use them effectively should be able to use them. So give us feedback. At present, we are working on 2 more instruments that are a bit more, are meant to be a bit more practical. One, we are working through a checklist that, you know, would definitely mirror our ethical principles, but that it's like an operationalization, and that it would have like a checklist of questions that you can follow at different stages, and you can, you know, start asking yourself whether, you know, the way you have implemented and developed your products is actually ethically appropriate. So that is one instrument. The other instrument we are developing is a maturity model. So I don't think it's necessarily intuitive for people in a company to figure out at what point are they in the ethical journey. So this is going to be an instrument that helps them look at you know, a series of aspects and say, okay, I have that, I have implemented that, I have that, but I'm still missing this. And, you know, you can find yourself at, you know, the stage that you are, and have an idea of what are the next steps. So this is what we are currently working on, but please join us in our weekly discussion, bring your questions, bring your input, and let us know if there is something that you think that would be truly helpful, and we can work on it together.
Okay, so how can we find these guidelines, Emily, that we've been talking about? I know you kind of mentioned giving us feedback. Where can we find this?
Yes, so if you go to the Open Voice Network's website, there is a section for our papers, and you will find all of our white papers there, and you'll be able to read each of them and also give feedback.
All right, thank you. Shilpi, the final question we have here, I'll address it to you, is from Monica. How is the implementation of voice AI in Latino American?
Well, I'm not an expert in that area, in that region, but I would say, again, going back to basics, like talk to the native language speakers as you're building technologies for those audiences. Bring experts from those native speakers, include them in the decision-making process, make sure that the data that you have collected it covers everyone and looks at all the angles, all the ages, and really covers all the nuances, the different dialects that these native speakers speak, and contextual language is important. And so making sure that all of that is given the utmost consideration when we are developing a voice technology for a given language. The last thing we want to see is somebody who is not a native. I'll give you an example of Hindi and Tamil and some of the Indian languages. Like there's translation as well as voice technologies being developed for these languages, and people who are developing them are not native speakers of Hindi or Tamil or any of these languages. And so the responses that you get from questions that you ask are so not the answers that somebody who is a native speaker can tell you. That is not the right answer. And so we need to make sure that these are given importance and consideration.
All right. With Emily, Valeria, Shilpi, thank you so much for participating in this webinar. Great job. I appreciate all of the hard work that you are doing to advance the ethical principles and living them as well. So would also like to thank everyone who's attended the webinar today. We take a moment, follow us on social media, join our email list, and to keep up with any upcoming papers or webinars we have. So we just really like to thank you and appreciate your time and your attention. And we'll see you next time.